I was in the group that sprayed Agent Orange in Vietnam from July 67 to July of 68. That was the heaviest year of spraying in the whole war. The government, through the Army Chemical Command, first started dreaming up the use of herbicides to use in warfare at the end of World War II. And there were ongoing studies in Fort Detrick, Maryland, going back to 44, 45. Those studies never totally ceased through the 50s and the early 60s. Then came Vietnam.
The targets are hidden behind a mantle of dense vegetation.
The enemy took full advantage of the terrain in the undercover. The option was to clear the area so we could see them. And that was why Agent Orange was so popular by the commanders in the field. And leaders of the country proceeded to heavily invest in the chemical applications of defoliating the jungle. We were constantly reassured that this was harmless stuff. That was the propaganda that was given to us throughout all levels of the military. The formulations for Agent Orange, they were developed by the military scientists in Fort Detrick, Maryland, did not have the toxicity of the Agent Orange that wound up being used when we mass-produced it and brought it to the field. The government decided to make more and more of it, and they took it from a rather controlled manufacturing process with one or two companies to where they wound up with about 8 or 10 companies that were actually producing it, and they had a number of subcontractors that were producing it. The problem became the chemical companies changed the way they were manufacturing Agent Orange to meet the production quotas. And it's very documented. They went from blending these herbicides under a low temperature for an extended period of time to blending them on an extremely high temperature in a short period of time, and that's where the toxicity of dioxin came in. That was really the root of the class action lawsuits that were brought against the chemical companies in the early 80s. There was a quasi-prohibition against suing a government supplier that was supplying things to a government specification. The crux of the argument was they made this Agent Orange different from what the specification was. Those lawsuits were making great headway until a judge forced a settlement that was very, very small, and that was dispersed within a couple of years. But it also shut off the dialogue and the disclosure of all this information about what really was in Agent Orange and what the effects could have been. So there was a tremendous amount of research data that could have come out of those industrial chemical companies that would have assisted the scientists in determining some of those things that we now know as the long-term birth defects and illnesses of our offspring. There have been several attempts to relitigate that have been unsuccessful to date. The theory that only those people that were in Vietnam were exposed to Agent Orange is not true. Agent Orange was used extensively in the United States. Massive amounts of it used in Florida, around the Eglin Air Base area, the panhandle of Florida, and that's where the ranch hand training was primarily done. Many of the military base commanders around the country found out that they could save money on their budgets by cleaning their perimeters with Agent Orange. It was used in a number of along waterways in a number of the naval bases around the country. Massive amounts of it were used in Panama. We also used it extensively in Korea. It was also, I believe, used in a couple of the bases in Japan. It was definitely used in the Philippines. It was much larger than the government ever said from the beginning. There have been a number of military leaders from Vietnam that have been asked the question, if you had to do it again, would you use Agent Orange as a tool of warfare? And I think almost universally they've answered, if we would have known that there was the long-term effects that were going to go on permanently, we would not have used it. It was not done out of any maliciousness. But that doesn't in any way alleviate the responsibility we have to the future generations that are going to suffer from this exposure. it could go 7 generations. Will be unknown, unheard of then, and the people will still be suffering from our exposures.